In this class, we're going to discuss the last 50 years of the sixth age of globalization, the age of industrialization. If we date this sixth age of globalization from 1800 to the year 2000, here we'll look at the period from 1950 to 2000. This is a period of tremendous significance and change for our world today, change that was fundamental in economics, in politics, in technology, and in global governance. And in terms of global governance, where I want us to focus in this class, the biggest change was the end or near end of the European imperial domination over much of the world, and especially over most of Africa and much of Asia. It is from 1950 or thereabouts onward that the European empires left their colonial possessions to become independent states. It is from 1950 or thereabouts that the European imperial possessions of Africa and Asia became independent states. On some occasions, the imperial powers left on their own, and in other cases, there were wars of liberation from imperial control. It was a long and messy and often very violent process, but it was a process of fundamental significance for our world today because it was a process that gave rise to dozens and dozens of newly independent countries, transforming Africa from a continent almost entirely under European colonial control to a continent of 55 independent nation states, and a similar transformation in much of Asia. Why did the European imperial era come to an end around 1950 and the aftermath? I think there were fundamentally two processes at play. One was the ongoing, unbelievably destructive and violent civil war of Europe itself, because we could consider World War I and World War II, with the economic crisis in between the two of them, as a kind of prolonged civil war of Europe from 1914 to 1945. This was a period of unbelievable destruction and bloodshed within Europe, and those two wars and the intervening Great Depression, of course, profoundly weakened the European economies, fundamentally undermined any claim of Europe to moral superiority, a very dubious claim to begin with, but after two bloody wars of Europe, a completely untenable claim. So the first of the processes that led to the end of the European imperial era was the internal battle within Europe. And of course, the second process was the movements for national liberation all over Asia and Africa, because there was a groundswell within these regions, as much as was possible with the brutal imperial rule, a groundswell of politics that called for European powers to go home to enable the peoples of Africa and Asia to determine their own futures. And those movements of national liberation were both peaceful movements, such as the remarkable movement led by Gandhi in India for India's independence, and often by necessity, very violent, because the imperial powers that resisted departing from their empires then faced insurgencies and wars of national liberation. One of the principal purposes and roles of the United Nations in its early years was to facilitate the transformation of colonies to independent states and new UN member states. So this was a process that had international law in its support, and the UN expanded by the dozens and dozens of countries as countries went from being colonial possessions to being independent nation states. In my view, independence from European imperial rule was not only a decisive change of politics and of human rights, but also a decisive change of economics as well. Because it was with independence, in my view, that economic development became possible in the former imperial lands. This is somewhat disputed because those who favored empire believed that empire would actually foster economic development within the colonies. But my view is that the economic interests of the imperial powers was mainly in extraction and in exploitation of their colonies, not in their independent development. And one of the pervasive realities of the imperial era is that the imperial powers did not want to offer education, even basic education, to most of the subjects of the empire. They knew, and they were right, that the more educated was the local population, the more it would resist the control by the European imperial powers. And so one of the responses to that absolute reality was to not provide even basic education except to a small proportion of the population. Many of the newly independent countries of Africa, for example, when they emerged as independent countries, had only a handful of people with even a high school education, because Europe had so brutally denied even a basic education to their own colonies during the period of 100 years of their imperial rule. Once independence came, what accompanied independence across the world were campaigns of literacy and the expansion of at least primary education to most of the population. Of course, it would take decades to build education systems, and until today, many places are still struggling to ensure universal access to primary and secondary education, and indeed, as SDG 4 calls upon all nations to achieve universal completion of at least upper secondary education. But it was independence of the colonies that made it possible to begin the path to universal education. And with education and literacy came an acceleration of economic development. One of the huge differences between the period 1800 to 1950 and the period 1950 to 2000 is that in the first 150-year block, the world was characterized by divergence, meaning that the rich were getting richer and were widening the gap with the poor. Whereas in the second block, the 50 years from 1950 to 2000, the world economy is characterized mainly by convergence, meaning a narrowing of the gap between the rich and the poor countries. And I attribute this fundamentally to political independence, and thereby the ability and will of the newly independent nations to educate their people and to start building a modern, what was then 20th century and what is today 21st century economy. So this is the hallmark of this crucial period, the post-1950 period up until the end of the 20th century. What do I want you to learn from this period? I want you to examine the major global political changes that characterize the world, the rise of independent nations and the processes, and many of you are living in those newly independent countries. So to understand the processes of political independence and the end of empire. Was it peaceful? Was it through war? How did it emerge? What was the state of the new nation at the moment of independence? What new policies were taken by the newly independent countries to start promoting literacy, mass education, and the process of industrialization? How did this process reshape the world economy? And how did international rule of law and institutions centered around the United Nations play a role in this transformative process?